And if you have any issues connecting through audio throughout the presentation, you always have the call me option available to you on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. There should be a number to dial in to get audio through your phones. We will be using the Q&A feature quite a bit today. Bottom right-hand corner of your screen, the Q&A feature is available. Please post your questions live throughout the webinar. We will go ahead and address them then out loud and talk through and answer those questions in this session. We also have a variety of webinars scheduled as well as recorded webinars on our on-demand page. So if you're looking for our upcoming schedule for future webinars that we have planned, whether it's about loan forgiveness, IDR adjustments, pay stuff, PD, whatever it may be, that is all on our PD page. And we are offering continuing education and professional development hours for this webinar. So if you stay tuned to the end, we will drop a link for the survey where you can go ahead and complete that to get continuing education or professional development hours. So we like to have this slide for folks who may be joining us for the first time and maybe are a little bit unfamiliar about who we are as an agency as well as a team. Our mission is to provide Illinois students with information and assistance to help make education, whatever that might be, beyond high school more accessible and affordable. We administer a variety of scholarships and grants across our state, whether that be a minority teacher scholarship, veterans programs, special education waivers, you name it. There are quite a bit of scholarships and grants that we now administer here at ISAC. In terms of us here on the professional development team and my colleagues here on the call, we provide a variety of professional development offerings navigating the financial aid process. We have sessions on resources for our underrepresented students, as well as sessions on student loan repayment and forgiveness programs. So here is our agenda for today. It is quite short, as this is designed to, of course, get you all to sort of participate and ask questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the open issues that FSA has identified and addressed. And I'll then go through some frequently asked questions that we are receiving in the field that maybe you may have in your heads or you have come across in the field. And then we'll go ahead and we'll transition into the Q&A portion. I'll stop sharing my screen and I will open it up for all of you attending. We will go ahead and read out the Q&A that we have there in the bottom right-hand corner. So I want to turn your attention to the open issues page here. This is on the FSA Partners website, and I do have that link there. If you just Google FSA Key Issues Open Alerts page, it should be the first thing that pops up on a Google search. Make sure you're on the right site there at the .gov site. And there's where you can sort of access and read through all of the open issues that have been identified via FSA and either have workarounds to them, maybe they don't have workarounds, or they've just simply resolved that issue. Now, a lot of these issues that they have identified, they have resolved. But I do still want to talk about them because we are still, of course, maybe dealing with students who came across these issues, say, early on in the application cycle when they kind of released at the new year. And maybe they're still waiting for the correction process, for example, which we know is not available yet. And they may have this issue and they don't really know about it. And they may not know about it until they go back into perhaps correcting their FAFSAs for whatever reason. So I just want to make sure that we're aware and highlight just a couple of them. Again, the full list is available on their site. The first issue that we had that I want to highlight is about incorrectly selecting citizenship status. There were students maybe who incorrectly selected that they were an eligible non-citizen. And when they go ahead and flip that, it did not allow them to continue on in the application. An error message popped up after correcting this, and they were not allowed to finish their application. That is an issue that has been resolved. Another example here is that the application was deleting signatures, sort of randomly and out of nowhere. And it was sort of unaware and kind of unbecoming to students and families who maybe they completed the application and maybe an SAI wasn't calculated and they weren't sure as to why. This could have been one of the reasons. And it may have prompted them then to say, okay, when the time comes, you will need to go ahead and re-log in and give a FAFSA correction, which is just re-signing the form. So student and parents who do that, right, they just want them to continue in and they were just prompted to re-sign the form. This issue is resolved. So the form should no longer be randomly deleting signatures. It should just be going ahead to prompt and everything should be normal here. But students were having this issue early on in the application cycle. They may need to go back in now when the correction process opens to then re-sign their FAFSAs. Another common issue that has been resolved were the college names being truncated when students are prompted to search the schools that they want their FAFSA to be sent to. And it was kind of difficult to distinguish between when colleges have multiple programs or schools or whatever. I remember I was working with the student in January. I think we were trying to search UIC, and 25 different UICs popped up. And as me, who has been working in financial aid for a number of years, it was even hard for myself to determine what was the right school I needed to pick. They had graduate schools on there, program names. It was very difficult to distinguish. They recommend searching by federal school code. This is actually an easy Google search to find, but also I've linked the FSA partners page where they have all the federal school codes listed. So if you have any doubt whatsoever about what's the right institution that you're looking for, searching by the federal school code is going to be the best way to ensure that is the right institution. They have said they have resolved that issue, and it should be more simple to determine what's the right institution, searching by the basic criteria they list on the application. But you may have students come across that perhaps they selected the wrong institution if they applied early on. Maybe they need to go back in and ensure that that's correct. And if there's questions, searching by the federal school code is the best way to go about it. Other just general issues with the site being very glitchy and buggy. If we have instances where parents are trying to start the form first and invite students to contribute on their section, sometimes there was different error messages. Perhaps they were saying a FAFSA had already existed for that student, even though there wasn't. A variety of issues that we have seen across the months when parents are trying to start the form on behalf of student. Now, even though this is an issue that should be resolved, FSA is still trying to recommend and reinforce the idea that this is the student's FAFSA. And the students have to be the ones logging in, being the main contributors to their forms, and inviting parents to be contributors. That is the smoothest way the application is going to work. So that's what they're continuing to recommend. So if you're coming across issues with the form that maybe aren't on the open issues page, you're confused, it's random, double check if you're working with a student or a family. If parents are starting the form for the student, perhaps that's the reason why. And have students go ahead and start the forms for themselves. Talk about just some now remaining issues that are going on in terms of processing delays. So we do know that FAFSAs are being processed now, and the backlog should now be up to date with the Department of Ed, as they had to backlog and process about 6 million FAFSAs. ISERs are also being sent out, and schools are just beginning to start packaging. However, there have been some issues with some of the processing as they move and they go ahead and they send ISERs to schools. First of all, FAFSAs that were processed prior to March 31st for a couple of dependent students who were required to report asset and investment information, but they weren't asked, those are going to have to get reprocessed. So some students who needed to report asset information were not being prompted to, and because of that, they now need to go ahead and reprocess those to ensure that these students are actually answering those questions that they are required to. This issue was resolved on March 21st. After FAFSA being processed after that, this was not an issue. But those prior to 3/21, those are going to have to be reprocessed. I believe the timetable, they are trying to finish that by this month, but we're going to have to wait and see for some additional guidance from FSA regarding that issue. An additional issue that's maybe a little bit more recent is the direct data exchange, which replaced the IRS data retrieval tool. It's having some problems in terms of correctly transferring over some tax information. Common categories that they have identified have been income tax paid, family size, or even education tax credits. Some of these categories are being reported incorrectly when clicking on over from the direct data exchange. So they're going ahead and they are trying to fix that as we see. Not a timetable for when that's going to be resolved, but there have been some processing issues with the direct data exchange. So again, I mentioned the reprocessing of some of these ISERs with these identified issues should happen this month sometime. But because of this is further delaying packaging, thus aid offers to students, because institutions on their end are trying to make sure they are receiving the right information so that they can give the right package and offer letter to their students so they can make an informed decision about where they want to attend. Okay, we'll go ahead now and dive into some frequently asked questions that perhaps you all have on your mind or maybe you have encountered in the field. Number one, who needs an FSA ID? The short answer is everyone, right? Everybody now needs an FSA ID to access the form. The one exception being if we have folks who married filing jointly. If they file married filing jointly, really only one parent then needs the FSA ID. Reason being is because the IRS then only needs consent and approval from one parent. That one parent gives consent and approval, they can just go ahead and enter demographic information for, say, their partner, right, their spouse, and then be able to sign the form, and the application will then be submitted on behalf of the student. Otherwise, we have married filing separately individuals, perhaps unmarried parents but living together. Both parents need FSA IDs. Both are going to have to receive invitations. Both are going to have to give consent and approval for the IRS. And then both are going to have to sign the application. So long story short, everyone needs an FSA ID, rule of thumb, including those without Social Security numbers. There's been a new process to allow these individuals to have an FSA ID, to give consent and sign the application for their students. Now, contributors without Social Security numbers, the way they're going to be able to verify their FSA IDs is typically to be asked a series of knowledge-based questions generated by a credit bureau called TransUnion. Common misconception that we've heard out in the field is that folks think that this is a credit check because a credit union is generating these questions. Not at all true. Not what the purpose of this is. It's only to sole purpose of verifying these individuals' identity. Just want to know who they are. That's all it is. It does not mean a credit check is being taken place. So most of these folks will be answering those knowledge-based questions. If they get all of them right, they should be good to go, and they will verify, and they'll be able to use their FSA ID the same day. If they get one or more of those questions incorrectly, they're going to have to go through what they're calling the manual verification process. Now, how this process has changed over the months is that now they should receive an automatic email with a correct manual verification case number from FSA. And they'll know that because in front of the case number, they should see the acronym MANVER, M-A-N-V-E-R. After that, it'll prompt them then to complete the attestation form. Attestation's a funny word for verification form, right? They're going to put that case number on that attestation form, which is available in English or Spanish. And then they're going to be asked to provide proof of identity with one of the following, whether it's a driver's license, state ID, or a foreign passport. Once they complete that, they can attach that document to idverification.ed.gov. And within 7 to 14 days, they should receive an email saying, great, we got your documents and we're good to go. Your FSA ID is verified and they should be all good. However, now that these contributors can hopefully get their FSA IDs more smoothly and now can contribute on the form, there's still two remaining issues for those folks without Social Security numbers. Number one, they cannot use the direct data exchange, right? Even if they have ITINs and they file taxes, the whole shebang, they just can't use it. They're going to be prompted to manually input their tax information. And this is just something that we don't know when that's going to get resolved, but expect that when folks without Social Security numbers are invited to the form, they're going to be able to access it now. They're going to fill it out. They may even hit consent and approval, and they're still going to be prompted to manually input tax information. That is normal, and that's what they're going to have to do. The second issue is quite a finicky issue that even myself I've experienced with the field that's been quite difficult, is that if there's any sort of mismatch in personally identifiable information, PII, whether it's inputted on the invitation itself versus what they would input on the FSA ID, it has to match exactly. Otherwise, the invitation is not going to pop up. And if they send multiple invites, error messages are going to pop up, and it's going to not allow them to continue, right? Even as simple as if an individual puts in their full name, and for whatever reason, if they put a space after that name, right, they hit the space bar after they input their name, the invitation's got to do the exact same thing, even as simple as hitting the space bar after that, because that's a character. It has to match exactly. So I have been in a couple of workshops, say in the weekend in this downtown Chicago, where we've had to take pictures of folks' FSA IDs and exactly what they inputted on there versus what the student is inputting on the invitation to make sure it matches exactly. Otherwise, the invitation is not going to click. Thus, that individual won't be allowed to access the application. So these very finicky issues here with the DDX and PII, there's no timeline for these issues to be resolved. At the very least, folks without social security numbers can now access the application and complete it, assuming these two things can get through. Now, there may be a couple of instances where folks do not see TransUnion questions be asked of them when creating the FSA ID. And that is okay, right? That is something that is possible. What that means by design from the system is that TransUnion doesn't have any information on this individual. And what they're going to see that instead of those TransUnion questions, it'll prompt them to call FSA to then start the manual verification process, as I explained in a previous slide. Now, in the past, the call center, as we've kind of experienced right over the last few months, has been completely overwhelmed. In the past, it was dropping calls because their system was overloaded, and that was by design. We have seen those wait times and getting in touch with FSA becoming a little bit easier. Wait times are dropping, and dropping calls has been less frequent than what I've heard. Now, when you do get in touch with FSA, you call them. It's very important in these situations to ask for a Tier 2 FSA ID specialist. This ensures you actually get someone live, an operator, a person, to talk to you to initiate the manual verification process for FSA IDs. We were seeing folks using the chat and email in the past. We were seeing folks get incorrect case numbers in this situation here, right? We had to ensure that it had the acronym MANVER in front of it, but they'll be prompted to call FSA, and when doing so, make sure that they ask for a Tier 2 FSA ID specialist. Another common question here, my family owns a business and a farm. Do I need to report it? If you are required to report investment information, meaning you see the questions on the application, all businesses and all farms must be reported. We report those assets, right, like we would any other asset, net worth, which is the current value minus any debt owed on it. That previous exception you may have heard in the past, right, when folks owned more than half of that business or farm, they had 100 or fewer full-time employees, that exception is no more. If they're required to report investment information, meaning they see the question on the application, all businesses and all farms must be reported. When will I be able to make corrections on my FAFSA, right? FAFSAs are being processed. We know this. ISAs are being sent out. Students can now access their FAFSA submission summaries, whether they're getting emails about it or if they just log into their account and they can access it via there. Some students are not getting emails, right? Typically in the past, when FAFSAs are successfully processed, we know that they can just kind of go in and make corrections when they need to. Not right now. Even if folks have their FAFSA submission summaries, everything's processed, the correction process is not available. We're waiting on guidance from FSA for them to announce when they're going to release this. They're saying mid-April, so maybe within the next week here, we're hoping. But right now, if you have students they're all dumb, but they know they need to make a correction, they're not going to be able to. The correction process is not available yet, and they're saying mid-April. So we're just kind of waiting and hoping that gets announced soon. Another common question we're getting in the field, when will gap access be available for counselors to view who's completed financial aid applications? So we've gotten a couple of additional guidance on this over the last week. Rosters have been uploaded for public schools, so public schools can see their rosters. Now maybe you begin to make a little bit of change there in terms of individual edits, but we know our private schools still need to upload their own rosters. That's always been the case. Now, we have received data from the federal government as we were waiting on, but we are currently in the process of testing that data received from FSA, and we're planning to release that financial aid completion data for you schools by mid-April. So then you're going to be able to see and match up, all right, who's completed what, and gap should look more normal in the course of the next week or two. So we're getting close to that point where gap access should be pretty much available. We're just doing some testing to ensure that this data from the Department of Ed is correct and working properly. Another common issue we see here, my parents created their FSA ID. They logged into the FAFSA. Everything looks great. They've given consent for the direct data exchange to take place, but they were still prompted to input tax information. I'm confused. I thought, hey, listen, once this DDX happens, I don't really got to fill out anything. The financial section should be quite quick. So why am I seeing this? A couple of reasons. I'll remind you of the previous reason on a couple of slides ago where I mentioned that if we have folks without social security numbers, contributors, going ahead and inputting their information on the form. They're going to be prompted to put manual tax information. That's normal. What you're seeing on your screen now are some additional reasons why that might be the case. Number one, if we have folks creating FSA IDs the exact same day they're trying to complete the application, it will prompt them to input manual tax information, right? The reason being because that FSA ID hasn't been verified yet, right? Even if folks with social security numbers, right? Typically that takes 1 to 3 days. So if it's not verified then because they're doing it the exact same day they're trying to complete the application, it's going to prompt them to manually input tax information, right? It is not uncommon. I've been with families who this has happened with, and that's totally fine. I have them stop and save and then have them relog in a day or two later when their FSA ID has been verified. Then when they click on the consent button, all their tax information will be transferred over by the direct data exchange, right? There's no point in them manually filing tax information just for a day or two later for that all to be overridden by IRS data anyway. Now, if you have families you're working with, they want to do that, they want to get the entire application complete right with you, that's totally up to them and that's completely fine. But it's not necessary. Second reason, perhaps they filed a foreign tax return, right? Thus, the IRS wouldn't have anything on file for them. So what they would be opted to is to, of course, be prompted to manually input their tax information. They're going to have to convert any currency into US dollars. That's always been normal. Another reason is perhaps their filing status in 2022 is different and not reflective of their current personal circumstances, right, as of today. Common example. Perhaps parents filed married filing jointly in 2022, but today they're divorced, right? And maybe mom's the only person going on the application. The IRS has married filing jointly tax returns on file, though, so it's not going to hit, and they're going to prompt them to manually input their tax information so that there's income information just for that one parent who's required to input their information on the application. So a variety of reasons why the direct data exchange may not be popping up for students. That'd be a total of 4 that I've talked about. Otherwise, all that tax information should transfer and the financial section of the application can be more streamlined. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen real quick. Do this. Maybe not. Maybe not. Sure. Tommy. Do. Nope, that's not it. Okay. Anyway, we'll go ahead and move on. So anyway, this is for an open session here for you all to answer your questions live. I have a variety of colleagues on the line to answer your questions. So I see one so far in the Q&A. We'll go ahead and speak this out. Thank you so much, whoever did that. So for students who have a processed FAFSA but did not add Illinois colleges the first time, should we be concerned that they will not be able to add them in terms of the MAP timeline? And I'll open that up for anyone who would like to answer.
I can tackle that one. So I'm going to say the concern is low at this point with this, just because if you think back to previous MAP suspend states, and if you're not familiar with what the MAP suspend state is, it's essentially we say, hey, the funds are going to run out for this program. Get your application in by this date, and you'll have access to those funds if you qualify. So the concern is low at this point for this, just because the MAP suspend date for last year was actually in September of 2023. So that's almost a year after that application actually opened. So we have some time at this point. And so FSA has indicated that the corrections process is going to be available in the beginning of in the middle of the first half of April. We're still kind of waiting to see what that will look like, but because that's supposed to be coming up pretty shortly here, and because that suspense date was so late and has been in previous years, the concern is definitely low at this point for the MAP term timeline.
Thank you, Beth. Other questions our participants have, please use the Q&A and feel free to input your questions so we can go ahead and get those answered for you. Anything you're experiencing in the field that you are confused by, we are happy to help. I can throw out some common questions that are maybe some softballs perhaps. Can anyone tell me how many schools a student can now list on the FAFSA?
I can take that, Tommy. So schools can list up to 20. So I think the biggest thing right now, I had a question come from a counselor of like, can a student go back in and add those schools yet? And the answer is no. They can't do that until they make a correction. So FSA, Federal Student Aid, there used to be a difference between what's considered a correction and an update, and it seems like now from what I've seen from parents and what we're seeing is that everything's just kind of considered a correction now rather than an update to their form. So that being said, so students like say they forgot to add a school or they wanted to change the schools that were listed, they can't do that till the corrections process is available. And so that hopefully will be this month, right? It should be by mid-April. The idea is that the student can go in and add that in. The other thing is that they shouldn't need to adjust anything else on their form except say the schools that they're adding or removing, and those things. But you may have those cases in which a student now needs to provide a signature again, because maybe their parent does because there was a thing about signatures being removed, but yeah, the corrections process is not yet available, and that will be available hopefully this month, and then the students can add those additional schools back in that they need to.
Thanks, Megan. Other comment questions, perhaps? I've heard that there's been some Pell Grant eligibility changes. How can I find out if I am eligible for a Pell Grant? Maybe before I fill out the application.
I can take this again, Tammy. So you're asking about the Pell Grant changes, the eligibility. So part of FAFSA simplification was that the Pell Grant went into kind of an overhaul in this sense. So the calculation itself of how our students, what is now known as their SAI, has been basically overhauled, and how the calculation works, or what you may know it as their students' EFC. So what's going to happen is that the Pell Grant calculation is going to be a little bit separate now than to calculate aid eligibility for like all other federal student aid. So we're talking federal work study, federal student loans. So the Pell Grant eligibility guidelines are now based on federal poverty guidelines. I mean, so that's all done on the back end, right? So a student never actually sees any of those things. It's done while they're completing the information as they're consenting for their tax information to be transferred in, as well as even if they're manually inputting their taxes in, their Pell Grant eligibility is still going to be calculated based on what they have entered. So it's based on federal poverty guidelines and based on a student's income, the student and family's income as well. But it also depends if they're a dependent versus independent student. So it's the percentage of the federal poverty guidelines based on dependent versus independent students. So from majority of your independent students who are 18, right, they're most likely going to get a full Pell Grant, okay? But if you have dependent families, say they make less than $60,000 for an AGI, that was kind of like the age-old question, like, well, what's the cutoff? And there is technically no cutoff. That is that answer. There is no cutoff, but the new calculations and the guidelines for Pell really kind of make the gap smaller for those middle income families to say, hey, if you could make say up to 75,000 combined adjusted gross incomes, but maybe you have other things, maybe your household size is of 6, right? There are a lot of other factors now that go into these things and it's based again on the federal poverty guidelines. So you may have students who would have not gotten a Pell Grant before now do. And you may now have students who had a lower Pell Grant will now get a higher Pell Grant as well. So again, it's still really kind of honing back in on, even if a family doesn't think that they're eligible, it's still encouraging them to apply, especially now because the calculations have changed on the back end. So.
Thanks, Megan. I do see a question in the Q&A. We just had someone ask. I can take this one. It says when a parent completes the parent section, the student's application is submitted automatically without the student signing and submitting. Why does this occur? So typically, right, in the traditional normal path that they want students to take for this, right, a student is completing their section first. When they finish their section, they're signing the form, right? They've already now then invited parents to contribute. Once parents log in and contribute all of their necessary information. Once they sign the form, the application is submitted then. Students have already signed the application, and thus the entire application is complete, prompting students to get a confirmation email. So that's why you may be seeing parents completing a section, signing, and then it says, oh, it's done, but wait a minute, did I not see a student do it? They may have already completed their section. Now, in a situation where you have a parent starting the application and signing the form, right? They're going to have students invite them to complete their section of the application. Then students will have to log in and sign on behalf of them. I haven't seen a situation where parents are logged in, they've completed the application, and then it says they're done. It'll require students to, of course, input their information. Perhaps a parent was completing an application maybe on behalf of themselves and they didn't realize it. That could be a situation then where it thinks it's them as the student. Other questions I see here now popping up in the Q&A. Thank you for participating. We have, as we are nearing the class of 2024 graduation dates, all of this year's FAFSA glitches and delays are causing enormous amounts of unnecessary fear and stress to Illinois students and families. Since these issues beyond their control are putting them at risk of not graduating, can ISAC or Governor Pritzker do a one-time suspension/waiver of the graduation requirement for this year? Or should schools do the gap access good faith effort thing or have them complete the waiver form? Megan, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, so ISAC's not waiving the requirement. We didn't waive the graduation requirement in the pandemic, and so there's no movement to waive the requirement this year as well. The idea in the process is that if a student completes either a FAFSA or a waiver, they've met the graduation requirement. If you have a student who you can for some reason not track down, they don't want to complete either a FAFSA or an alternative app or a waiver, what's going to happen is that the principal can only do the good faith effort form. So as if you are a school counselor, you can see it on your end that that the good faith effort on gap access was completed, but the principal has to complete that form. Again, if a student is 18, they can complete the form themselves online, the waiver, so they can do it right then and there if they come down to you or you're trying to track them down. But ISAC's not going to waive it. ISB is not either. ISB wants to see how many of your students are completing an application as well as the waiving of the applications. You of course can reach out to us if you have questions about how students can complete the waiver, as well as getting support in completing a financial aid application, but as well as completion of the good faith effort form. But again, the good faith effort is only the principal can attest to that for your students. But know that once the FAFSA data matching becomes available, hopefully this month, is that you will be able to see which students have completed a FAFSA or an alternative application as well as a waiver. So hopefully you only have a few students that are left that may not have anything, and that you can either have them do a waiver, complete a FAFSA, or have your principal do a good faith effort. Yeah. But the good faith effort is meant to be as a last resort kind of thing. If for some reason the student does not want to complete either a waiver or complete an financial aid application. Yeah.
Thanks, Megan. Another question I see in the Q&A here. Tammy's asking if will students see if they are receiving Pell or MAP when they log in at this point, like in previous years? I'm assuming this is after they filed the FAFSA, but maybe Beth, if you want to tackle that.
Yeah, so the FAFSA submission summary is going to give this information. It is going to be estimated information at this point. So just know that that is not an exact amount until they get that information from the university itself or from the institution, that they'll have their amounts that are on their financial aid offer, but they will have the estimated amount on that FAFSA submission summary. Yes.
Thanks, Beth. Let's see, other questions we may have received in the field we can kind of go over now. My parents created their FSA ID, but we had to type in income information manually. Do I have to wait until corrections are open? And I don't know if maybe you want to tackle that one?
What was that? I'm sorry.
Sorry, so the question was, my parents created their FSA ID, but we had to type in income information manually. Do I have to wait until corrections are open to fix that?
No, you do not. So if you completed, even if they created their FSA ID the day of and they had to enter their information manually, as long as they provided consent on the back end of things, they'll be able to, once your FSA gets verified, they'll be able to provide that information.
Perfect, thank you. Another just common question we've always gotten, how will I know if my FAFSA has been processed? Olivia, would you like to take that one?
They would get an email saying that the application has been processed. Other than that, the email would be that it's been received.
Right, yeah, so look at a confirmation email for sure once they complete it, and then when it gets processed, they should get an email as well saying, great, your FAFSA has been successfully processed. And then they can either receive their FAFSA submission summary that way, or when they re-log into that application, they'll be able to access their FAFSA submission summary that way as well. Thanks, Olivia. Let's see, another question that's common with the new application cycle. My student who I'm working with, they selected that they only wanted to apply for direct unsubsidized loans. Thus, it didn't require them also to provide parental information. Does this mean that they are an independent student? Megan, would you want to take that one?
Yeah, so what's going to happen is that because for some reason this year the department really decided to change some questions, and this one was one of them, was about applying for a direct subsidized only, and it really kind of threw students off. Some of our other team members watched a family answer the question wrong right in front of them. And so if you had students that said yes to this question, that they only want to apply for a direct unsubsidized loan, and they didn't enter parental information, and they were supposed to, yes, the student is considered as an independent student, but they're considered as a provisionally independent, meaning that the student is if they're eligible for a Pell Grant, they're not going to get one, okay, because they're only applying for a direct unsubsidized loan. So in this case, if you know that students accidentally answered that question wrong, what's going to happen is they do need to make a correction to their FAFSA, and then once the correction process becomes available, the student will need to log in and edit that answer and say, no, my parents are not unwilling to provide. And so then therefore it prompts that student to then add in contributor information for their parents or parent. So yes, now you may have a student that, no, they don't have any other extenuating circumstances, but they do believe that they're an independent student. Then okay, they can still follow up with the financial aid office. You know, there may be something that you're not aware of, but it's important to know that if they said yes to that question about applying for direct unsubsidized loans, they're treated as a provisionally independent student, but they're not going to be eligible for federal work study or a federal Pell Grant if they are, based on how they answered that question. So again, if it tripped a lot of families up this year, and the department has tweaked the question. They have edited on the form. So it's something now that once the corrections process becomes available, again, if a student accidentally answered that wrong, then they will need to go in and just edit the question and then finish completing the form with the parental information.
Megan, can you explain a little bit more about that provisionally independent portion? That wasn't the case in previous years. What's the difference this year with provisionally independent students?
So because of FAFSA simplification, what happened this year, in the last several years, especially with this year, is that FSA has created what is called a provisionally independent student, meaning that if for some reason a student believes that they're considered independent, but they can't answer yes to either one of the 13 dependency questions, or they can't answer yes to saying, you know, that that they don't know where their parents are, or these other extenuating circumstances, but maybe they live at home, but they are they're still at an abusive home, but they can't leave their home yet. So yes, they have contact with their parents, but they're in this really unhealthy situation. So what's going to happen is that a student can say yes to say that they want to be considered for a provisionally independent student. And then what will happen is that the financial aid office will need to follow up with the student. The student can also follow up with the financial aid office and explain to them what's going on. Again, these are things that maybe a student does not want to talk about, but this provisionally independent status allows for a student to be considered independent and receive potentially a dependency override, meaning they don't have to report parental information on their FAFSA, but can then be considered an independent for financial aid purposes. So at that point, then the school will ask for documentation. Now, each school is going to be a little bit different on how they confirm a provisionally independent student. Some schools will want to see police reports. Some schools will want to see letters of support. It purely depends on the institution. We were at a financial aid conference just about a month ago now, and one of these new things is that, say you have a student who gets a letter from your high school homeless district liaison, and says yes, the student is experiencing homelessness and they're unaccompanied. They use that documentation to answer yes to one of the questions on the FAFSA. A financial aid office then can use that to show the documentation from the year prior. So say a student enrolls at their local community college and then they transfer into a four-year institution. The four-year institution can use that documentation from the financial aid office at the community college to still show that the situation is true. But this provisionally independent really kind of focuses on those students that they can't answer yes to some of those, the dependency questions, but they do believe they have an extenuating circumstance. It's just not listed as they see it on the FAFSA. So.
Thank you, Megan. Another common question I've gotten, I can handle this as well. Megan kind of touched on this a little bit with financial aid administrators being able to kind of carry over dependency overrides, for example. But there's been some changes for homeless unaccompanied youth, and folks have been kind of asking about what those changes are. One of the biggest changes, I should say, is who can now make a determination of homelessness. That has sort of expanded in previous years. So when you go onto the application, if you're helping a student and a family, you'll see some typical determination folks that you may have seen in the past, whether it's, high school homeless district liaison or any program with federal TRIO or a Gear Up grant. But some additions, like Megan talked about, an FAA, a financial administrator, can make that determination now, as well as they have a line in the answers and part of the question that says any other program that serves folks experiencing homelessness. That any other program is never in there in the past, which makes it very, very broad. Is to say, if there's any program out there, the director, the leader, the designee of a director of any program serving folks experiencing homelessness can now make a determination of homelessness for these students. So it really kind of broadens and expands who can do this, and hopefully allows then, students who are trying to find these people to make determinations a little bit easier. See, another question we got is, what can a family do if they have now multiple students in college? Beth, would you mind handling that one?
Yeah, so this is a question we get a lot just because this is a change from the previous year. So if a family has multiple students in college on the 23-24 FAFSA, there was a question that asked about that went into the calculation. For 24-25, that calculation is no longer going to be including that number in college. So the question still appears. There are certain laws that require, with the FAFSA Simplification Act, there were laws that required certain questions to be removed or certain questions to remain. And so that one, it still remains, but that is no longer going to be impacted by that calculation. So we get that question of what can families do then if they have, say, 2-3 kids that are in college at the same time, because that SAI is no longer going to be cut in half. So one of the things that we have seen families do and financial aid offices have kind of talked about a little bit is the fact that you can go to the financial aid office and you can request an appeal, professional judgment for this instance. Of course, financial aid offices, they have they can say no, right? They have the final say in that, but that could at least maybe alter that SAI a little bit, alter some of that calculation for that student to potentially qualify for some more aid. It's just not going to be slashed in half like it was with the initial calculation previously.
Thanks, Beth. I'm going to throw one more at you, and then we're going to have to start wrapping up a little bit for today's webinar. I saw with one of my students that there was a red H that appeared on my student's FAFSA submission summary. Why is that?
Yeah, so this is going to indicate that a student needs to make a correction. So yes, the correction process is currently still not available. They have said by the first half of April that this correction process will be available. And so a student could go into their FAFSA submission summary on studentaid.gov. They can look at it and they'll see it marked by whatever questions maybe there's some kind of an issue with. One of the ones that I've seen in just the recent days has been that a student marked that they were experiencing homelessness. Now, say that they marked that correctly, they had not indicated that they have a determination from one of the sources. And so that's an instance where maybe the student is trying to get a dependency override, but there was a mismatch in information that the FAFSA had identified that the student needs to go in and then make a correction for. So that is why a red H would be appearing on a student's form, is to make a correction.
Thanks, Beth. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up here just a little bit early. We have another webinar. We have to go ahead and get started. I don't see other questions in the Q&A, but if you do have questions, I mean, throughout this entire financial aid cycle, you know where to contact us at the ISAC.outreach training inbox. Feel free to send us emails anytime, and we can, of course, help you with anything that you need. I'm going to go ahead and reshare my screen just one more time here. I have opened the chat to go ahead and drop in that SurveyMonkey link to go ahead and request your CE and PD hours. Don't mind my screen popping here. Here we go. So that survey's been posted in the chat. Again, bottom right-hand corner, it looks like a little iMessage bubble. That evaluation will be due in about 48 hours. We always do that here. So Thursday, that's spelled incorrectly on that screen, April 11th, 4:30 p.m. is going to be our deadline. If you are specifically requesting PD hours, please make sure you input your Illinois Educator Identification Number. We have to see that in order to award you PD hours. Again, bottom right-hand corner of your screen for the chat, click on that evaluation and complete it to request it by Thursday, April 11th, 4:30 p.m. And then in about a couple of weeks, we go ahead and send you those completed forms. Otherwise, I want to thank you all very much for participating and asking your questions. I want to thank our panelists as well. Again, if you have questions throughout this financial aid cycle, do not hesitate to give us an email. We'll be happy to assist you with anything that we can. With that, have a good rest of your day, everyone.